last week, me and Austin uh, went through this roadmap. It's just kind of like a high level overview on what we plan to do in the upcoming months. And I believe we got up to a convert bonus. Correct me if I'm wrong, Austin.
I don't think we went over PI 7, honestly. I think we mostly talked about the oil snowball change and the integration stuff and maybe the soil order book.
Yeah, I think you're right. Uh, let's start with the PI7 then. So throughout the discussion we had in the Discord, it was determined that we wanted to implement some sort of convert penalty downwards when the system has just got above peg or above its value target, apologies. And this is, as I think 4Pinto kind of quotes it best, to let the protocol breathe. And we have an implementation written down in the Discord where over the course of, I believe, 12 seasons, you have this penalty curve, which is logarithmic and decays to 0% over that time. Uh, the implementation process, Nato just gave me a spec to review or a contract to review right now. So we're gonna try to review that and then see if we can deploy it anytime soon. Uh, I guess do we want to talk about like more the impetus? Not sure where we want to go from here.
Well, maybe to just zoom out briefly, because I know we have a couple listeners here, and also maybe we'll get some other listeners on the recording later. You know, this is not going to be the most formal or manicured presentation of all the stuff we're working on. As you can see, some of these, the names for a lot of these changes are not so fleshed out at this point. But in the spirit of trying to just get started and sharing and sort of, disseminate some of the knowledge as far as what's happening, this is where we're at. And so hopefully over the next couple weeks or so, we can start to publish, maybe a graphic of some kind, describing what upgrades are coming to Pinto over the coming months. But until then, I sort of view this as a brain dump session of some sort. So, if you have questions, feel free to chime in, just unmute and chime in, post them in the chef's chat, etc. I feel like that may, be an even better guide. And definitely wouldn't want to spend a lot of time talking about things that people don't understand without them asking questions and the like. Sorry, Friho, what was your original question?
No, thank you for setting up the scene. Yeah, this is a massive brain dump. I mean, even these dates are a little vague in that, like there's just so many things that depend on one another. It's unclear when will when something will get done or like what's the priority or whatnot. But yeah, I mean, we wanted to just write down what we're currently working on, what we expect to work in the future, the relative uh, timelines on everything. I noticed a date up here, but these are very subject to change. I think like just this morning, I had to push this audit everything back like a week based on audit availability. So not to say that we don't wanna adhere to these dates or as close as possible, but everything's all pending. And like Austin said, once we have the bandwidth or we have the time to make a more concrete timeline, this is all pending.
So maybe just to paint a picture of like this month through May, let's call it. I think that it's helpful to sort of center the community around what expectations they should have over the next couple of months at minimum. Earlier this month we launched S Pinto, which is the fungible ERC20 wrapper for Pinto deposits, in addition to the integration with Cream Finance. Also PI6, Pinto Improvement 6, launched last week, which was this implementation of what we've sort of dubbed this soil snowball effect, where the soil that's issued initially when there's no demand is very small. And as demand increases, it slowly ramps up to, I think it's, more or less like a max of 4% of the soil that was being issued previously. So those went out over the last couple of weeks. I guess I would describe it, in a lot of ways, this is sort of practice for me and making sure I know what's going on as well and talking about it. But I think that the next few high leverage things we're working on are a soil order book via Tractor, the TLDR of that being a way to sign away the ability for Tractor operators or bot operators to submit sow transactions on behalf of users. I think that that is particularly important now with the particularly low amount of soil issued, where, at 100 soil, perhaps there's less incentive to bust out the hardware wallet. Whereas if you can sign away the ability to sow, call it 10K over the course of several seasons, and tip a bot operator for doing so, hopefully that combined with the field or soil snowball will have a bigger effect on demand for soil and or at least sowing activity in general at minimum. So that's one of the bigger ones coming out in the next couple weeks. Excuse me, the next month or so. I mean, Freeho, would it be fair to say that the convert penalty down is more like PI 7 and the one being audited is PI 8?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this timeline should go here. Yeah. So let me just write that here. This is TI7, the convert stock penalty, and then everything audited here, which includes the code starting from PI0 and the stuff we changed from stock to Pinto. This is really PI8. There's a lot more like, just code in general, and it touches so many things, which we feel like requires an audit.
Right. So in that case, PI 7 is this convert down penalty above peg that Ben talked at length about on Friday, I think it was. So I would encourage people to listen to that recording and also, ask questions here to the extent people are curious about it. But I think the one or two liner is that converting down based on the amount of time spent above peg will be penalized for a short amount of time or a short number of seasons. I think those parameters are still to be finalized. So that's PI 7, and then PI 8 is where you were starting to go, Freeho. Do you want to give us an overview on that?
Yeah, it's a lot of stuff though. So maybe we can try to go through them one by one. Uh, Maybe we can start with the new stuff that we're gonna add beyond just the PI7. The first thing here is this measuring demand for soil. Uh, Specifically, there are like a couple cases in which the measuring demand for soil is inefficient. The first case is that, currently we measure soil being sold out to be like everything but one soil. And this threshold itself is not the greatest because people are incentivized to sow all but one soil. Basically, the threshold needed to get everything but sold out, right? And this is particularly important with the soil snowball upgrade, where there's just not a lot of soil in the first place, whereby there's going to be many instances where you, as a sower, want to sow some amount, and it's going to take you multiple seasons to sow. So with that in mind, there's probably an incentive for you to have the temperature either stagnant or increasing. But typically when soil in demand is sold out, it's a higher chance, it's the protocol evaluates it such that demand, potentially is increasing. And thus, by manipulating how much you sow such that you don't hit that sold out threshold, uh, it makes it easier for someone to, basically force the protocol to never sell out, right? And the reason why the one soil threshold is too small is that when in certain scenarios, there might not be an incentive for someone to sow that remaining soil. Uh, so one of the changes in this measuring demand for soil is to make this threshold dynamic uh, based on the soil supply, such that no matter what, even if someone were to manipulate the soil supply such that there is some minimum threshold above, the remaining soil is attractive enough to sow. Just to put an example, let's say there's 100 soil out there, and someone were to sow 99 of that soil, uh, such that there's one remaining soil. Soil right now is not sold out. Uh, if the temperature is quite low, let's say 1% or 5%, if someone were to sow that one soil to make a profit when the system would harvest that plot for a dollar or 1.05 pinto, still does the profit is like 0.05 pinto. And if the gas cost for that action plus like just the incentive to do it is less than 5 cents, someone's not going to do it. But now the threshold, this new updated threshold is either 50, or if the amount of soil is less than 100, 50% of the soil, such that like even if someone were to manipulate the soil, uh, or just sow less than or just slightly above the sellout threshold, 50 soil is enough to incentivize someone to sell. Going back to the first calculation where the temperature is 5%, a 5 cent difference or profit is not that attractive, but certainly at 50 soil is much more attractive. So a bit of a ramble, but that was kind of the justification for changing the demand for soil for that threshold. Thoughts or no thoughts, or just want to keep going?
No thoughts on this end other than would be curious to know how often that's actually being a problem at the moment, which I assume is not often, but definitely still worth fixing in the long run.
Are you saying like with the new soil implementation or prior to
I
it?
mean, the fact that right now that all soil sown into is defined as less than or equal to one soil remaining. Uh,
Yeah.
that specifically. I'm not sure how big a problem that has been historically, but I agree in the long run it's totally manipulable.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the point is that it's like more impactful now that soil is even less. Whereas before, yeah, it was so marginal, it doesn't really matter. In the long run, it does matter. I guess the implication here was that there's a bunch of small changes here, and I think it's just so hard to warrant one single PI here. Thus, we combine a magnitude or numerous small improvements to the protocol here, and just to include that with the previous changes, such that even though we feel like it's unclear the potential benefit of this measuring demand for soil, I feel like it's still worthy to add. Yeah, I kind of agree. It's like hard to know at the moment. We have more analysis. The other change, which I feel like is more impactful, is that currently it is pretty easy to manipulate the system into thinking demand for sow is increasing. This is because there is no like minimum threshold to sow, such that it measures demand. You know, currently, Pinto, whenever soil isn't sold out, checks the delta between the soil sold out this season, or sorry, not sold out, just sold this season, and the amount of soil that was sold last season. And if it's greater than 5%, the system considers demand for soil increasing. So you can expect someone to like sow micro amount of pintos in one season, and then just increase the amount they sow next season by a mere 5% of a micro amount, and basically manipulate the system to for soil demand to be increasing when there's not a lot of demand of soil in an absolute sense. Uh, uh, so the fix for that is that there has to be some minimum amount of soil sown in a season for demand to be measured. That makes sense. And by default, if it doesn't hit that threshold, assume soil demand is decreasing or steady. Not sure if we've like discussed this more, but certainly if there's like less than one soil being sown, it's hard to say whether demand for soil is increasing. So this eliminates a lot of potential manipulation with very low capital.
By the way, for Mo-chan said his mic wasn't working, but he was trying to ask what sort of data insight would be interesting to study with regard to soil. Um, Personally, I don't think this is in the Dune yet. It might be in the upcoming like seasons table that Sage of the Silos has been working on. But I would love to understand like season by season when the ratio of the amount sown is being used versus the time of sow. I don't think we have great data on that.
Yeah, we would love to have
Maybe that would
data.
be helpful to report in the field bot channel as well. I don't know. It's a little bit much for the average user, but it would be helpful on this end to understand what's happening.
Yeah, a lot of that
So
info should be in the upcoming seasons table. I mean, not like maybe not specifically with regards to how it determines what the cases are, but like the information for when the soil is fully sown and what time it's fully sown. Um, like when it does fully sell out, that does become one of the inputs.
Nice. Awesome. Glad to hear it.
yeah, I mean, right now it's very hard for us to kind of hard to evaluate our measuring demand for soil in the first place, and that currently we have a 5% bound on measuring whether demand for soil is decrease or steady. Apologies, and yeah, it'll be great to know is that like how many cases, or I guess the absolute change in demand on season or season basis. Are there seasons that we consider or the system considers demand for soil increasing that should have been steady? Are there cases where demand for soil was decreasing but was considered steady or stuff like that? I feel like we hadn't gotten the data to evaluate that stuff yet. And I think that would be awesome to see. I feel like 5% is so low at the moment. I mean, we've had discussions on whether that should be increased or decreased at the moment, but the high level idea is that we don't even have the data to conclude that whether or how good is 5% at the moment, and it will really help, I think, with this kind of stuff.
Oh, Chen, could you send the link to that dashboard you had worked on previously when you get a chance?
Yeah. Also, I think I fixed my mic, but yeah, I'll get it to you guys.
What's up, dude?
What is up, Mo Chen?
Yes. Hello. I have not been too active with the data stuff, but I've been trying to get back into it. But it's nice to hop into these calls. Hopefully, I can make more of them.
Thanks for joining.
Hey, glad to have you, dude. Where are you posting the dashboard?
I'm grabbing the link. I accidentally was about to post a localhost link. I don't think that would have worked, but
I don't know. Localhost always works for me.
I need to find a better place to host this because I'm using a community cloud, so they always like make my app sleep if no one's using it. But I posted it. I need to update it. I hope to get it updated this week with what's on my computer. But here's the current live version. I think the flood dashboard is the main thing that's working, but we're not really in a flood season right now, so there's not much to glean.
One day.
Wait, where did you post that?
In the voice chat here, I'll ping you.
Voice chat.
I guess there's two voice chats here. I'll post in both.
Oh wow, yeah, this is so hard to find. Apologies. I have this.
No worries. Discord has not made this easy.
Boom. Okay. Back
In
here.
my local, I was working on some field analytics. I don't know where I should post.
Whoa, this is sick.
Oh, I don't know why that was maxed out, but
What is this delta?
I was working on trying to figure
rate?
out
Sorry, what is this delta real rate of return here?
what's in the live one? Oh God, this page. Okay, so the protocol overview page. This is a mess. I was using this for testing a bit ago. I would ignore this page. This is me just dumping every value from the subgraph onto the main page because I was figuring out what the numbers were doing. This is honestly not that useful. It's just a numbers dump. But I was messing around with some field analytics earlier, like time to harvest. But I found time to harvest really difficult to work with.
Yeah.
But I think there's some more interesting things to do with soil stuff. I don't want to derail the call. It's just I'll share more at the next town hall, I guess.
No, the whole I'm happy to get derailed. It's a dev call, we should show cool stuff like this, I feel like. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's interesting because the UI, I mean, for me personally, has to cater towards certain audiences, right? And then, one audience that it doesn't feel like it caters for right now, it's like data analytics. Which, I feel like Dune is poised to do, but there are some things we can't do in Dune. So I think like a separate website where we're able to more deeply look at these analytics, I feel like helps so much. For example, I'm just putting a number or a parameter out there. It's like the delta, like, I would love to see convert volume over a course of, the lifetime of Pinto. I feel like that would be useful to think about in regard to like the convert penalty. What is the demand to convert right after the system has just crossed its value target, right? Uh, Stuff like that.
Yeah, I
Yeah, I
think
mean,
incorporating some of the data. I think right now my main data source is the main seasonal stuff. So every season there's a lot of I think aggregated statistics over the course of that season. That's like, okay, here's the new sort of pods available, or I guess pod growth, stuff like that. Or during flood season, there's a lot of interesting stuff. Like every season, you could see the status of the current flood. I think that was interesting back then. So the next data source I really want to work with is the Dex active kind of data set, kind of like rather than me waiting for data every season, there's like the data that's constantly coming in with people converting. So like, when during the season they're converting? Is it early in the season during the morning auction, or is it like, right before the next morning auction? And also like the swaps, like figuring out the volume of people trading and how it's interacting with converts and stuff like that. Like maybe if there's a big whale that converts, is there a lot of volume that like follows it, of people like reacting to the big peg shift, or target shift maybe. Yeah, I haven't integrated that sort of data stuff yet, but I do think I agree with the visibility and accessibility of those data sets, especially for people that want to do things like what I'm doing. Um, in crypto in general, I feel like it's been tough in general. I don't know if Dune is the answer for everybody, but yeah.
yeah, I mean, not to derail the conversation too much, but data has been always a hard thing to do in crypto land. Uh, it's kind of a shame on the kind of tools we've had, historically, uh, and so to access data, because we have this, mantra that, all the data is accessible, and in theory it's all accessible, but in practice it's very hard to get it in a very, packaged format where people can easily take the data and do whatever they want with it, right? Uh, one of the reasons why we move or Beanstalk moved from ETH to Arbitrum was, purely the fact that there was so many gas savings uh in place. And because we're able to more do the things we want to do on L2, like we have certain events that we didn't polish before. For instance, in the Pinto protocol that helps with all this data analysis. Like before, I think PI3 or PI4, you know, we never emitted the actual, I think, demand for soil on a continuous basis. We always just emitted the case ID, like the state in which Pinto is in. And that loses so much data, we're returning a continuous spectrum to these 144 cases. Uh, since then we've taken stance, much more of a aggressive stance to admit all the things we need to admit. Uh, but yeah, totally +1 on the inaccessibility of data at the moment. And Dune is great, but it definitely can be improved as with a lot of things. But yeah, I mean, I know you said you use the subgraph. I assume you've been talking with Pinto Pirate, and definitely wanted to just emphasize that if there's anything you want or you could get or would like to get, anything really from the subgraph that's currently not in the subgraph, then let us know, and we'll be happy to accommodate and try to make it as aggressive as possible.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I've talked to Pinto Pirate. I think there's so much good work being done on the subgraph side. So I hope they re-engage more with the data side of the Pinto conversation. So hopefully y'all can see stuff soon. We'll see.
Yeah, shout out Pinto Pirate. He was always goated with the subgraph.
Thanks, sirs.
I like this Pinto stock here. It's kind of funny here. Pinto stock subgraph. Great. Let's get back to the road to glory. Thank you for the side combo. That was a great one. Where were we? I think we were on no, we were on the measuring demand for soil. Wow. Wow, what a side tangent. Uh, But yeah, I think here what the solution was is, after every season, we just check that Pinto or, the amount of Pintos that were sown into the protocol exceeds some minimum threshold. Uh, just so, there isn't, just so the cost to manipulate the system is much higher. Uh, you know, like we said, people can currently manipulate the system for soil to be considered increasing with a marginal amount of Pinto. You know, we don't want that happening once the system is at, uh, hundreds of millions, right? Imagine being able to control the temperature changes with just dollars of Pinto a year. Who wouldn't do that, right? So this is a pretty, I mean, it's one of those things where it's a small change in terms of like code, uh, but it has like large implications, I feel. Great. Does anyone have any final comments or questions before we move on to the next thing?
Hit us with the next one.
Hidden. Okay, next is the new soil issuance above. So, and for the sake of, I don't know what the right word is for speed or minimizing the amount of code that we changed with PI6, uh, to maximize security or minimize security risk. When we were looking up the soil issuance formula below, we also talked about the soil issuance above. And we felt like the conclusion of that was, yeah, we want to change it, but and for the sake of minimizing what is unaudited, we felt like the benefit of having this change released sooner wasn't worth the additional security risks. So hence, I put it here. But a high level of what it does is that we, have this current formula, and maybe just to preface at a high level, what is the current formula? You know, the amount of soil issued above peg has, to like our understanding, a upper limit of how many soil can be issued. And the amount of soil that can be issued is the amount of soil such that if everybody were to sow that soil, it would equal the number of pods that became harvestable in that season. So, for example, if 1,000 pods became harvestable last season, you know, Pinto would issue some amount of soil such that if all that was sowed, it would equal 100 pods. So that's the base case. Then we have this scalar, which increases or decreases that amount based off the pod rate itself. So, when the pod rate is low, generally Pinto wants to issue a little bit more debt to head back to optimal. And when Pinto's pod rate is very high, it wants to issue less pods, such that it heads back to optimal as well. This scalar kind of controls that. So I think the current scalars is like 1.2 to 0.25, depending on the state of Pinto. But the point is that currently it's very discrete. Like if Pinto's at a high pod rate, it just sets the scalar to, I think, 0.2 or 0.25. Apologies for not knowing. But obviously we see that the pod rate can range drastically from that, even with a very high pod rate range. So this first thing where we said existing pod rate scalar linearize is just to change the scalar to continuously decrease or increase as a function of pod rate, rather than just setting specified like thresholds, in which the pod rate scalar changes. I know that was a lot. Let me know if that was a little bit confusing.
The main point is that it's just now a continuous function instead of being discrete.
Yeah, I mean, we're starting to take a stance that like more things should be, linearized or like continuous, right? Historically, we kind of had these, I don't know what to call them, tranches, like these thresholds where after you hit it, the variable suddenly changes a lot, you know? So we want to experiment more with these more granular changes as a function of something else. You can see this. I'll show you how well you can see it, honestly, but the scale of soil above peg, which scales the soil above peg, it's a function of the case ID, and then you can see it changes, maybe it's hard to see. It changes the scalar based on this case. The goal is just to linearize it, or the goal is to make it continuous. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on what that function will be?
Default choose has already made it. At a high level, it just takes the same bounds we have for the pod rate above 25% and pod rate less than 3 and just places it in that range. So as before, we had, I think, multiplier 1, 2 when above excessively high, 1x or above reasonably high, and then 0.5 and 0.2 or below. Now it's just a linear scalar that ranges from 0.2 to 1.25, ranging from the low pod rate to the highest pod rate, with a cap of 25%, i.e., like if the pod rate is greater than 25%, we stick the scalar at 1.2.
Got it. So it's still discrete below 3% and above 25%, and then continuous between those two values, more or less.
Yeah, exactly.
At least for now.
Totally. Like, I think we've discussed before, we meaning just me and Austin, that like there's not a lot of granularity in the pod rate where we have this excessively high case above 25%, but it'd be nice to have like a excessively high pod rate, maybe like 100% or 200%, where the behavior can change even more. It just feels so crazy that the system is adjusting based off of excessively high when the theoretical range is infinite for that. But yeah, in theory, like we could add on to this function such that there is some additional continuous function beyond the 25%. Like there's a kink somewhere, it changes the curve, or it's one smooth curve. There's there's a huge design space here.
Cool. Thanks for the explanation.
Of course. And then this is also so this is what we have, these two terms here are basically what we have now. The caveat is that we're going to make this a linear function or linear continuous function instead of step bounds. And then we're just going to multiply this by the new cultivation factor. To preface what the cultivation factor is. Cultivation factor is this new parameter that we added in PI6. That is basically this parameter that fluctuates between 1 to 100% and changes as a function of the sold out. So this parameter is what really causes the quote unquote snowball effect. As more soil gets sold out, the amount of soil availability increases, leading to like an increased demand or potentially increased demand of soil selling out every season. And we felt like this cultivation factor should be also added to the above soil calculation because we don't want to hit a case where the cultivation factor is very low, the system crosses its value target, and then suddenly the amount of soil issued above peg or above its value target is significantly more than the soil issued below its value target. So thus we wanted to add this cultivation factor onto here. It's interesting because when we're calculating the amount of soil below its value target, we have this distribution period factor as well, which basically the attempt is to like spread out how much soil is issued over the course of some time. Like given that Pinto isn't in a rush to return to its value target, we decided not to put this here, mainly because it doesn't make as much sense. The point of issuing soil above its value target isn't to attract debt, it's just to measure demand for soil. So it just felt right, or makes more sense to not include this distribution period and just to add this cultivation factor, because cultivation factor is a function of soil demand, right? Or soil selling out, which kind of goes into line of this whole equation.
Does that mean we're going to end up issuing more soil above peg? And
Uh,
given that not just the 1/24th factor, but also the 1 minus L2SR factor.
I mean, there are certainly cases where, it's hard to say from like a guarantee perspective. This function here also has a minimum of around 50, similar to below peg. I would say, I can say for sure this is going to issue less soil than we had before this upgrade from above peg. But it's hard to just say like, well, we're going to issue less soil above its value target than compared to below its value target. There are cases where if the delta P is low, below peg, and then we're above peg, and delta P is very high. There are cases where there's more soil issued above peg or above value target. Apologies. So I wouldn't say it's a guarantee that it'll always be the case that you'll issue less soil above its value target, but I can say that this change is going to make it so there's less soil above its value peg from the previous implementation.
Definitely, I agree.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, it's so hard to know, honestly, with these kind of things. Like, if we add the distribution period, which is currently set at 24 hours, we're going to reduce this delta P by, or sorry, the whole pause harvest by another 24x. Like, that's insane. And at that point, it's very hard to measure the soil demand for soil at that point. So, yeah, these things are hard, I feel, to know prior. Great. There aren't any questions, we can go to the next one. I think this is actually not in progress. This is in review. Get this right here. Yeah, I kind of have a backlog here. Sorry, default juice, but I'll review them, soon.
No worries, no worries. I mean, all those like small improvements are ready for review.
Great. Yeah. The default juice been crushing these. Like every day, new PR every day. It's so fast. I didn't keep up. Great. So this one, gauge point bound update. This has actually two things. Maybe I'll can right here, normalization. So maybe to speak out the second one, the normalization of gauge points. Maybe to zoom out and see what the problem is. Currently the system does not target the total amount of gauge points the summation of the LP tokens have. LP token gauge points themselves, and just to say what
I'll
they
bring
do.
up the Dune chart.
Yeah, can I get a link? I think we have like another one somewhere. Maybe this one is good enough. A little bit.
Yeah, I was thinking of this seasonal gauge points one.
Yeah, okay. So, the gauge points, they determine how many seeds each LP token should have at a high level. And the way they increase or decrease with every LP token is a function of how far their current deposited PDV is from their optimal. Is a pretty simple idea. Like, if the amount of deposited PDV is higher than optimal, then we should decrease the gauge points to decrease the seeds, and thus disincentivize people to convert there. And if the amount of PDV is less than optimal, then we increase the seeds. So generally, we've been seeing that there's been like this trend where the amount of seeds or the total amount of gauge points have generally gone up. I'm not sure. There's no summation thing here, but just looking at this graph, you kind of see like there's more instances where the gauge points increased than they have decreased. Now, this is partly a function, or this is mainly a function of how we set the thresholds for the gauge points themselves. But the point I wanted to bring up here is more that the gauge points total summation has increased over time, right? Now, why does this matter? Why does inflation of gauge points matter to us? It matters because the gauge point distribution, or the distribution in which how the seeds are distributed based on gauge points, is just a simple equation where it's like the percent of the LP's gauge points, right? If Pinto USDC has 50% of the gauge points, it gets the 50% of stock associated with LP. As the amount of gauge points, the total increase, one of the things about the gauge point system is that the amount of gauge points we issue or increase or decrease each LP token by is static. So like, here every season and with the Pinto USDC, well, it was off by some amount. Oh, this UI is not it's not coordinating with me. This is crazy. it increases by either like 1, 3, or 5, a static amount. And as the amount of gauge points increases, the impact of that change, whether it's 1, 3, or 5, decreases over time. So, for example, I think when we first started Pinto, the gauge points was 1,000. Now the total gauge points is around 2,000. So what this means is that every time the C gauge system with the LP, iterates, it changes the LP points by like 1, 3, or 5, but effectively the impact it has is half of what it had in this first season, right? And because the impact is halved, it takes 2 seasons to have the same effect, which kind of lends itself to a increase in not only gauge point but the rate of gauge points increasing. So over time this may lead to massive gauge point inflation, such that the gauge points themselves don't really matter anymore. So yeah, a long-winded answer why fixing the gauge points at some static number helps retain this property of knowing that how much you add or decrease to one gauge point LP system, how much it increases or impacts the system, right? Whereas now, given that dynamic total gauge points, it's unclear how much that 5% really helps or negates. Any questions on that?
No questions here.
Amazing. I must
Just want to signpost. I do have to have another call at the top of the hour. I'll have to hop to, FYI.
Cool. Not a problem. I'm happy to keep going for like another 30 minutes or so, if people are willing. What's the consensus on y'all? I think
I feel like if we have content, just wrap it up and do another next week. That'd be my position, but I defer to you.
Great. I don't want to waste or spend too much time. Maybe we just wrap up on this gauge point bound, and however long that takes, we keep on going and then continue on next week.
Sure.
So, great. So the second part is that the bounds in which we add or subtract gauge points is not balanced, I think is the best way to say it. Currently what we do is that we check, given its optimal gauge point distribution, we have like predefined thresholds that define how far away this value is from its optimal. We have like a relatively close approximation, somewhat close, somewhat far, and very far. And based on that, it increases or decreases the gauge points by 0, 1, 3, or 5. Now, the issue is that these thresholds aren't symmetric. They were calculated in a relative basis. So just to give an example, for Pinto USDC, the threshold or the optimal threshold is 25%. And below its optimal, the threshold is 10%. Just for simplification, we'll do 10%, 20%, 30% away from optimal. And that maps out to be 22.5, 20%, and 17.5%. Those are like the percent thresholds. Now on the upside, we don't multiply the 10%, 20%, 30% by its optimal. We actually do that percentage, based off the distance, based off the 100% minus optimal. So for Pinto USDC at 25%, basically the thresholds would be, let's say, like 32.5, 40%, and 47.5. At high level, it just means that the thresholds are biased away, or currently the thresholds are created such that the system has an inclination to increase its gauge points rather than decrease. Which you kind of see in the seasonal gauge points here. You see like all these seasons, the Pinto cap soul pool has increased, once in its whole, or just one time in its lifetime, and never decreased. in this Pinto USDC, well, it's always increased. There's always a tendency to increase or decrease. The reason why we designed this initially was that we wanted a relative basis such that, we wanted to reflect that it was easier to increase the deposited PDV than decrease. But, upon analysis here, like, it's clear that that's not the appropriate stance to take. So, one of the upgrades, the other half of this upgrade is to change the threshold such that the thresholds are symmetric. Back to our example of 10%, 20%, 30%. Now we're above, when the LP token is above its optimal, it will simply just do 10% of 25, 20% of 20, 25, and 30% of 25. So a threshold being 27.5, 30%, and 32.5. And this should make it such that the incentive, or I guess the distribution is now, or the bias is now neutral, and thus the system can actually decrease its gauge points when it's the positive PDV is away from optimal on the upper side. I mean, the interesting thing for me is that, like, even though we have these two inefficiencies, the percent of positive PDV was generally pretty static or pretty equal, or reflected its optimal very closely until this recent market downturn. I believe this current distribution is kind of based on the fact that Bitcoin has retained most of its like value compared to other volatile assets. But even so, it's been kind of interesting for me to see, like, even the system works pretty well, even with these inefficiencies. So don't think this is mission critical, as in like the system's gonna the LP distribution won't converge back to its optimal without this. But certainly this will help in that regard. Anyone have any comments or questions?
Just that writing this white paper version will be a doozy.
Oh my god. Yeah, writing white paper versions are always such a doozy. I mean, we were sprinting to write the current, I guess not the current, but the original PI0 white paper. There was so much. I mean, prior to this, I wasn't very active in the Pinto white paper development. And in the few days I was, active, it amazed me on how much thought and effort came into this. So yeah, it's a killer effort for sure. And a lot of appreciation now after going through it. All right, gang.
All right, I have to run now, but thank you for the overview.
Yeah, I think we're done here too. We're gonna out here. A good place to call, I feel like. All right, same time next week. See you guys.
Bye. Thank you.